Dragon King Ilyan sank Cerys Dunlow's ash ferry while her dead husband's handprints were still burned into the rail. The harbor fleet had gathered on the obsidian ferry steps to watch the sentence. Black war barges crowded the lava canal. Noble evacuation ships floated behind them beneath polished heat shields, while smaller civilian ferries waited downcurrent under mourning banners. Cerys stood between two harbor guards with soot on her widow's veil and an iron seizure band around her right wrist. Below her, the Ashwing strained against its chains. She and Oren Dunlow had built the ferry over 11 winters from black cedar, furnace shell, and hammered slag. Its starboard frame carried a long repair seam from the Red Channel evacuation. Oren's palm marks remained beneath the stern rail where he had pressed cooling resin into place before the final ashfall. Harbor Admiral Corliss Bray read the judgment from a bronze tablet. Cerys Dunlow abandoned the Western civilian convoy during the Red Channel evacuation. 28 passengers were left without passage. 14 died before the royal fleet returned. Cerys looked toward Ilyan. The Dragon King stood beneath the fleet standard in volcanic armor. Heat moved faintly through the seams at his throat. His expression revealed nothing, but she remembered nights when that control had failed. He had boarded the Ashwing without crown or escort when violent dragonfire made royal transport unsafe. He had trusted her to guide him through channels narrow enough to scrape sparks from both sides of the hull. She had never recorded those crossings or used his weakness against him. Now he had come to destroy the only thing she and Oren had made that death had not already taken. Corliss raised the harbor record. The fleet archive states that noble vessels were ordered through the western narrows first. Civilian ferries were instructed to hold below the obsidian steps. That was not the first signal cast into the canal, Cerys said. Corliss lowered the tablet. Emergency authority supersedes ordinary sequence. Then read the emergency gate order. The archive contained the final command. It contains the command your office preserved. The widow's memory is shaped by grief. My memory did not lower the noble gate. Silence crossed the steps. The noble gate was a floating barrier meant to shield royal ships from sudden lava surges. Lowered at the wrong hour, it did not stop the heat. It diverted molten pressure and burning debris into the civilian channel, Corliss said. The gate protected vessels carrying treaty heirs, war officers, and bloodlines required to keep the eastern provinces loyal. It decided which side of the harbor would burn. It preserved the realm. It buried families beneath the current. Ilyan descended one step. Did you receive a royal command? Yes. What did it order? Civilian ferries were to cross first. Noble vessels were to hold beyond the eastern pillars. Do you possess that signal? No. Who witnessed it? Oren. Her husband's name entered the harbor like a dropped anchor. Corliss answered softly. Oren Dunlow died after illegally damaging a vessel under emergency fleet use. A dead man cannot confirm his wife's memory. Cerys looked at the Ashwing's starboard seam. Oren had not died breaking his boat. He had died preventing the fleet from turning it into a noble shield. During the evacuation, a royal towing hook had been driven into the Ashwing's frame. Corliss's officers meant to chain the smaller ferry ahead of a noble barge, forcing it to absorb the first wave of heat while civilians remained trapped on the steps. Oren had cut the hook free. The recoil split the frame and threw him into the molten channel. The fleet called the damage self-destruction. Cerys called it his last honest choice. Ilyan looked at the repair seam. Why was that absent from your testimony? Because the officers who seized the ferry wrote it. Corliss faced the king. She rejects the archive, 3 captain statements, and lawful emergency hierarchy. If every ferrymaster may replace written command with private belief, evacuation discipline collapses. Cerys met Ilyan's eyes. The current did not change because Corliss called it emergency authority. Only the deaths the fleet was willing to count changed. His jaw tightened. For one moment she thought he remembered crossing beside her without royal insignia, trusting her hands more than his guard. But trust given in darkness did not survive daylight. Remove Cerys Dunlow from the western route, he ordered. The seizure band tightened. Transfer ferry authority to harbor command. Corliss bowed. Cerys did not look away. And the Ashwing? The answer took too long. Sink it. Dragonfire chains released beneath the steps. The ferrule tilted. Molten current swallowed the repaired seam, the cabin, and the rail bearing Oren's handprints. Cerys watched until the stern disappeared. Then light stirred beneath the lava. One glow became 10. 10 became hundreds. Lava lanternfish rose through the molten channel, their translucent bodies carrying gold and blue command light beneath glass-like scales. They did not judge guilt, defend widows, or restore drowned orders. Harbor signalers cast commands into molten current, and the fish absorbed the residue. When a vessel sank across a stored signal trail, they released the sequence in the order the canal had received it. The fish circled above the drowned ferry and leapt. Lines of fire joined across the smoke. Western civilian ferries cross immediately. A second signal followed. Noble vessels hold beyond the eastern pillars. The crowned dragon seal of Ilyan Vork burned beneath both lines. Corliss stepped back once. The first signal was superseded. The final emergency authority remains in the archive. Ilyan raised one hand. No one disturbs the signal. He did not release Cerys or restore her route. He only looked toward the place where the Ashwing had vanished. The lava had returned his command. It had not returned the ferry he had drowned. And it had not cleared Cerys. It had only returned the first order the harbor archive had buried. The lanternfish had returned the first signal. They could not tell the court what men did after it. Their bodies sank one by one into the molten canal, taking the last blue-gold fragments of command light with them. The harbor darkened around the place where the Ashwing had disappeared. Proof had risen too late to keep Oren's handprints from sinking. Harbor Admiral Corliss Bray recovered first. The king's opening signal was superseded by emergency authority, he said. The lanternfish preserved sequence, not final command. The fish remembered command light, Cerys replied. They did not remember intent. Then they cannot establish misconduct. No. They established that your archive began after the truth had already entered the water. Ilyan looked toward the bronze evacuation tablet in Corliss's hands. Produce the Noble Gate log. Corliss did not move. Those records contained fleet defense intervals, treaty movements, and military harbor capacities. They also contained the hour the gate was lowered. Opening them publicly would expose procedures still used during siege evacuation. Then open them under fleet witness. The admiral's gaze moved briefly to Cerys' seizure band. She remains stripped of harbor authority. Ilyan's expression hardened. The band remains active. The transfer of the western ferry route is suspended until the gate record is examined. The first order had returned. His sentence had not. Cerys felt the iron tighten against her skin when she stepped closer to the harbor table. He had preserved the signal only after drowning the vessel that proved it. Corliss sent 2 officers to the sealed archive. While they waited, the lava lanternfish vanished below the black surface. They offered no second message, no name, no judgment. Whatever happened after the first signal would have to be found in metal, pressure, and the decisions men had written as necessity. The gate log arrived inside a heat-proof iron case. 3 captains broke its seals before the fleet. The first entry recorded Ilyan's original command. Civilian ferries forward. Noble vessels held east. The next entry did not replace the route. It activated the Noble Gate. Time: 6 minutes after the first signal. Cerys looked at the civilian departure column. Only 2 ferries had cleared the western channel. 7 remained below the obsidian steps. The gate lowered before the civilian line passed, she said. Corliss answered. Because the upper surge reached critical pressure. Which side registered it? The western mouth. Then why lower a barrier angled toward the civilian cut? To shield the larger hulls. The Noble Gate did not stop the lava. It chose where the lava was allowed to go. Several ferry captains looked toward the canal. Cerys took a charcoal stick and drew the harbor shape on the stone table. The Noble Gate stretched diagonally between the eastern pillars. Lowered during a surge, it protected the deeper royal berth by forcing the molten current into the shallower western channel. The civilian cut was narrower, she said. Pressure rose faster there. The ash rafts jammed against the wall. Burning debris struck the ferry line from behind. Corliss pointed to the emergency notation. The noble vessels carried treaty heirs, command officers, and the Eastern Fleet's succession families. And the western steps carried children, furnace workers, laundresses, and canal keepers. The realm could not lose both. So, you selected which passengers the realm was permitted to lose. Emergency authority requires such choices. It requires the truth about them afterward. Corliss's restraint sharpened. The Ashwing was rated below royal surge capacity. Requisitioning it for fleet support was lawful. Cerys turned toward him. Then you admit it was requisitioned? I admit that every harbor vessel becomes fleet. Use property during evacuation. Show the requisition entry. The damage interrupted documentation. The damage was the documentation. She looked toward the molten place where the ferry had sunk. The starboard frame must be raised before the outer slag cools, Corliss said. The wreck is condemned property. It was condemned 5 breaths before the fish contradicted your archive. Ilyan ordered 2 salvage chains lowered. He did not look at Cerys when the hooks entered the lava. The Ashwing surfaced in pieces. Its cabin was gone. The stern rail had burned away. Oren's handprints no longer existed, but the starboard frame remained locked beneath a shelf of hardened furnace shell. Cerys stepped to the edge. Turn it. The salvage crew rotated the blackened timber. A puncture opened beneath the repair seam. Not a crack from heat. A driven hole. Molten silver clung to its edges, mixed with the blue mineral used on royal towing teeth. Corliss said. That proves emergency fleet contact. It proves the hook entered from outside. Cerys pointed to the angle. A rescue tow is fixed along the current. This was driven across it. One of the older ferrymasters crouched beside the frame, to hold the smaller hull sideways. As a shield, Cerys said. The noble barge would have remained behind the Ashwing while the ferry took the first blast of redirected heat. Corliss replied. The maneuver may have protected both vessels. No ferry survives broadside against a gate-diverted surge. Oren resisted lawful requisition. Cerys touched the dark repair seam. Cooling resin filled the split from within. Oren had pressed it into the wound before the final ashfall, trying to keep the ferry afloat long enough to return for those still trapped. Below the resin lay a clean diagonal cut. The edge was narrow at the top, wider where the blade twisted. Cerys knew the mark. Oren's ferry axe, Corliss said. He damaged fleet use property. He cut the towing hook before your officers could chain the Ashwing ahead of the noble barge. The act endangered strategic passengers. The hook had already turned our ferry into their heat wall. Oren's handprints had not spoken. The seam had. It preserved the puncture, the recoil split, the axe cut, and the desperate repair he made after freeing the boat. Cerys looked at the wreckage. He did not die breaking the Ashwing. He died trying to keep it from being used to protect nobles, while civilians burned behind the gate. Ilyan studied the puncture. Can the hook be identified? A royal metalsmith scraped residue into a black dish. Royal towing teeth use different alloy ratios by command vessel. The harbor foundries mark each flagship set. Corliss said. Hooks are transferred between ships. Then the transfer records will show it, Ilyan replied. The metalsmith heated the residue. 3 colored flames rose. Blue, white, then a thin green edge. His expression changed. That pattern belongs to one registered flagship. No one spoke. Cerys already knew which vessel had held position behind the Ashwing during the evacuation. The metalsmith faced the fleet. The towing hook came from the admiral's command ship. Behind Corliss, the black hull of his flagship waited above the channel it had redirected toward civilians. The hook had come from Corliss's ship. The sentence had come from Ilyan's mouth. Corliss Bray stood beside the recovered starboard frame while the royal metalsmith sealed the residue dish. Flagship equipment is reassigned during emergency operations, he said. A matching alloy does not establish who ordered the hook driven. It establishes where the hook belonged, Cerys replied. It establishes original registration. Then the transfer ledger will show when it left your ship. Corliss looked toward Ilyan. Emergency requisition records contain the locations of command vessels, reserve chains, and evacuation capacities. Opening them before civilian witnesses compromises fleet security. Cerys raised her banded wrist. You opened my ferry to condemnation before the whole harbor. You were judged under public loss law. And your equipment is protected under private security law. Ilyan ordered the hook ledger brought from the flagship. He did not remove the seizure band. He suspended the transfer of Cerys's western route for another day and entered her as a material witness to the wreck examination. Witness was not restoration. It was only a better cage. The court had raised a frame from the lava. It had not raised the life built around it. The hook ledger arrived bound in black iron strips. Each towing tooth issued from the admiral's flagship carried a numbered alloy pattern. Transfers required a receiving vessel, an officer's mark, and a reason for reassignment. The entry matching the Ashwing's residue appeared halfway down the evacuation page. Hook set 7. Transferred to civilian ferry Ashwing. Purpose: emergency heat shield requisition. Authorized under harbor survival law. Corliss rested one hand on the table. There is your record. Cerys did not read the words first. She touched the edge of the ink. Harbor ledgers were written with heat-set mineral pigment. Fresh script remained dull until exposed to furnace breath, then cured into a faint glass sheen. On evacuation day, the archive chamber had overheated badly enough to blister the outer page corners. Every original entry carried fine heat cracks. The Ashwing requisition line did not. The ink was added after the archive cooled, she said. Corliss replied. Many damaged entries were reconstructed after the disaster. From what source? Officer testimony. Which officer? The reconstruction table does not require individual attribution when fleet authority is confirmed. So, the record proving lawful requisition was written after Oren died by men serving the office that used the hook. It was repaired after fire damage. The page around it was not burned away. Cerys pointed to the clean line. The pigment entered after the heat cracks formed. Someone wrote between old entries and cured it under controlled flame. The metalsmith examined the surface. She is correct about the curing. Corliss remained composed. Correct about age, not falsehood. Disaster records are often completed after action. Ilyan looked at the ledger. When? The archive keeper checked the furnace mark on the reconstruction seal. 17 days after the evacuation. Cerys turned toward the wreck frame. Then the boat must answer what the ledger cannot. The starboard seam lay exposed under cold ash cloth. She asked the metalsmith to remove the outer slag in layers, rather than cutting through the timber. The first layer held final ashfall. Pale volcanic glass fused over everything beneath it. Below that lay cooling resin pressed from inside the hull. Oren's palm ridges were gone, but the direction of pressure remained. He had forced the resin outward while the ferry was still afloat. Beneath the repair sat the recoil split. The wood had torn away from the puncture, not toward it. The hook had pulled sideways after being cut. At the deepest layer, the royal towing tooth had entered before the axe blade touched it. Cerys traced the sequence without laying her hand on the burned timber. Hook driven first. Axe cut second. Recoil split third. Resin repair fourth. Ashfall last. Corliss said, that sequence proves Oren resisted requisition, and then attempted to repair the damage he caused. No. It proves the ferry was still carrying civilians when he cut it free. You cannot know who remained aboard. The resin was applied from inside the lower passenger rail. A ferrymaster beside her examined the angle. A man repairing from there would have been braced between the bench supports. Cerys nodded. The cargo deck was too hot by then. He worked where the passengers were sheltering. Corliss turned to the fleet witnesses. The Ashwing was requisitioned because civilian ferries lacked sufficient heat capacity. Attaching it ahead of a larger barge created a combined shield. It placed the weaker hull first. It allowed the stronger vessel to push both through the surge. The towing tooth entered broadside. Cerys pointed to the puncture angle. It was not attached to pull the Ashwing through. It was attached to hold her sideways across the current. The ferrymaster looked toward the noble gate. A broadside hull would take the first redirected wave, Corliss said. A temporary maneuver under extreme conditions. A shield, Cerys replied. Made from a civilian ferry whose passengers had already been ordered across. Oren obstructed lawful fleet use. The requisition did not exist until 17 days after he died. Authority existed whether the clerk completed the line or not. Then show the authority used that morning. Ilyan ordered the emergency warrants opened. Corliss objected. Those warrants bear royal war powers. That is why they will be read. The harbor clerk brought a narrow bronze roll sealed with the crowned dragon. Cerys recognized Ilyan's mark before the wax was broken. Years earlier, during border war, he had granted fleet-wide authority to requisition private vessels when enemy fire threatened the capital. The warrant had expired with the war, but beneath the original seal stood a renewal notation. Activated for Red Channel evacuation. Renewed at First Ashbel. By Harbor Admiral Corliss Bray. Corliss had not forged Ilyan's wartime power. He had awakened it. The same authority that once allowed the fleet to seize warboats had been used to take the Ashwing, place it before a noble barge, and call Orin's resistance unlawful. Cerys looked at Ilyan. Corlys's metal had pierced the ferry, but the power behind the hook bore the king's own seal. The renewed warrant did not excuse the hook. It revealed how much harm could hide inside authority Ilyan had never narrowed. Corlys Bray stood beside the bronze roll bearing the crowned dragon seal. Fleet-wide requisition exists so commanders may preserve strategic lives and vessels before panic destroys both. Cerys looked at the drowned remains of the Ashwing. You preserved a noble hull by placing an occupied civilian ferry in front of it. You assume the barge was empty. Then open its boarding record. Corlys's expression remained controlled. Treaty manifests contain protected names, succession arrangements, and military appointments. I do not need their names. I need the hour their weight entered the hull. Ilyan looked toward the harbor clerk. Bring the priority manifest, boarding clock, and draft register. The seizure inquiry does not grant her access to royal passenger records. Corlys said. She remains a material witness. Cerys raised her banded wrist. Witness was not restoration. It was only a better cage. Ilyan did not dispute it. The route remained suspended. The iron band remained locked around her wrist. The Ashwing remained beneath cooling lava with Orin's handprints burned away. Corlys's metal had pierced the ferry. Ilyan's order had drowned what remained. The protected records arrived inside a white furnace cloth case. The witness clerk covered the passenger names and exposed only embarkation times, declared weight, vessel draft, and priority class. The royal towing hook entered the Ashwing 9 minutes after the first ash bell. According to the boarding clock, the treaty heirs did not reach the noble barge until 23 minutes later. The war officers boarded after them. At the moment the Ashwing was forced broadside across the current. The barge carried 6 guards, 3 sealed command chests, and no protected passengers. Cerys looked at Corlys. Which strategic lives were aboard? The vessel itself was strategic capacity. An empty hull. A hull required to remove treaty heirs whose deaths could have reopened 3 border wars. People already stood on the western steps, and others were coming. So you diverted the lava toward those present to preserve space for those not yet there. Corlys turned toward the gathered captains. Evacuation command cannot wait until every valuable passenger is visible. Capacity must survive long enough to receive them. Cerys pointed to the gate log. The civilian ferries were already loaded. They lacked royal heat ratings. The Ashwing crossed the Red Channel for 11 years. Not against a noble gate surge. Because no sane harbormaster lowers that gate before the western cut clears. Corlys's voice sharpened. The upper pressure threatened the entire eastern berth. The noble gate did not remove that pressure. It sent it somewhere your officers had decided mattered less. Ilyan read the original wartime warrant. One clause allowed the admiral to preserve strategic command capacity before personnel boarded. His own seal stood beneath it. I signed this during the border siege, he said. When enemy fire was striking military docks, Cerys replied. The authority should have expired with the war. It did. Her gaze moved to Corlys's renewal mark. Until your admiral awakened it during a civilian evacuation. Corlys answered. The Red Channel collapse threatened royal continuity no less than enemy fire. And you were permitted to decide what continuity meant. That is the purpose of command. No. That is the danger of command without witnesses. Ilyan ordered the noble barge inspected. Corlys objected. The vessel remains part of the active evacuation fleet. So did the Ashwing when I ordered it sunk. The admission held no apology. It did not restore the boat. But it kept him inside the act, rather than allowing him to stand outside it as another deceived king. The noble barge floated above the eastern berth, its polished furnace plating untouched by the final ashfall. Cerys boarded under guard as a witness, not a ferry captain. The seizure band burned when her boots crossed the royal deck. Ilyan followed. Years earlier, he had stepped onto the Ashwing without crown, armor, or royal emblem. She had refused to cast off until he removed the dragon clasp from his cloak. No symbol of command on my deck, she had told him. A ferry answered to current and weight, not rank. Now he stood behind her wearing the same crowned dragon that had authorized the seizure of her home. Cerys examined the barge's draft rings. The molten stain from evacuation night reached only the 4th mark. The vessel was less than half loaded when the gate fell. Corliss said, which confirms sufficient capacity remained for the treaty party. It confirms the hull you shielded was nearly empty. She moved to the forward towing drum. Royal barges used 2 brake settings. A straight pull setting guided another vessel behind or beside the barge. A crosslock setting held a smaller hull broadside, forcing it to absorb pressure before the larger ship. The drum remained fused in crosslock. 1 chain slot was empty. The missing hook set matched the residue recovered from the Ashwing. Corliss examined the mechanism. The setting may have shifted during recoil. No. Cerys pointed to the brake tooth. Cooling slag had hardened beneath the locking pawl. The lever had been set before the hottest surge struck, then sealed in place by falling ash. Orin had not left a message. He had left damage in the order men caused it. The hook had entered his ferry because this drum had already been prepared to hold the Ashwing sideways. The harbor clerk opened the barge's equipment timing roll. Each brake adjustment required a heat stamp from the deck officer. The crosslock setting had been entered before the first ash bell. Before the surge reached critical pressure. Before Ilyan's civilian first signal entered the canal. Before Corliss claimed emergency necessity had forced his choice. Cerys looked from the fused drum to the admiral. The fleet did not decide to use the Ashwing as a shield during the disaster. The witness clerk read the time again. Someone aboard Corliss's command barge had prepared the crosslock, while the harbor still believed the evacuation would proceed normally. The emergency had not created the sacrifice. It had given the fleet permission to carry it out. The crosslock had been set before the harbor knew it needed saving. Corliss Bray examined the fused towing drum without lowering his head. Command barges prepare multiple emergency configurations before every evacuation. A locked mechanism proves readiness, not intent. Cerys looked across the polished deck. Then show the same preparation on the other noble vessels. Corliss turned toward Ilyan. Opening the entire fleet to a widow under seizure would disrupt active harbor command. The route transfer remains suspended, Ilyan said. Inspect the other barges. He did not remove the iron band from Cerys' wrist. He did not return her title. He only widened the inquiry after the Ashwing had already sunk. 3 noble vessels were brought alongside the admiral's barge. Their towing drums remained in straight pull position. Their cross-lock teeth were clean. None carried cooling slag beneath the locking pawl. Only Corliss's command vessel had been prepared to hold another hull broadside. Corliss replied without hesitation. The flagship carried the strongest tow assembly. It was logical to prepare the most versatile configuration there. Versatile for whom? Cerys asked. For the harbor. You keep using the harbor when you mean the people your office ranked above it. The deck clerk brought the pre-sailing equipment roster. Each chain, hook, shield plate, and emergency brace had been checked before dawn. The crosslock drum appeared under a special designation. Forward heat brake assembly. No receiving vessel was named. Cerys studied the weight column. The assembly included a towing hook, 2 lateral chains, and 4 broadside braces sized for a ferry hull. Not a war barge. Not a royal cutter. A civilian ferry. The Ashwing's beam width, she said. Corliss looked at the figures. Several Western ferries share similar dimensions. Only one carried furnace. Shell reinforcement strong enough to remain intact for the first impact. That strength made it suitable for emergency requisition. It made it useful to sacrifice. Ilyan read the roster. When was the assembly prepared? The clerk checked the furnace stamps. Before sunrise. 2 hours before the evacuation signal, Corliss said. The upper channels had shown instability throughout the night. Then why were civilians not moved before dawn? Cerys asked. The fleet awaited confirmation. But the shield assembly did not. The harbor had not known whether the Red Channel would collapse. Corliss's flagship had already prepared to seize a civilian ferry if it did. Ilyan's gaze remained on the measurements. Who selected the dimensions? The deck clerk's face tightened. The forward master entered them. Name him, Master Peldorn. Corliss said. Dorn died during the evacuation. Another dead man placed between the admiral and responsibility. Cerys examined the equipment roster more closely. Peldorn's mark appeared beside the chain inspection. But the measurement figures had been written in a different hand. The numerals leaned left and closed their lower loops with a hooked stroke. She had seen the same writing on harbor weight orders issued from Corliss's office. The dimensions were added by an admiralty clerk. Corliss answered. Command offices prepare equipment specifications. That is ordinary practice. Before any emergency existed. Before an emergency was confirmed. Cerys looked toward the submerged western steps. That distinction killed people. She requested the pre-dawn loading witnesses. Corliss objected again. Dock laborers cannot interpret strategic preparation. They can say what they carried. 2 furnace hands and an elderly chain fitter were brought aboard. The fitter recognized the broadside braces. We were told they were for a heat break hull. What hull? Cerys asked. No name was given. Were they fitted to the flagship? No, stacked near the forward hook. Did you ask why? The man glanced at Corliss. I was told a western ferry might be required. Before the first signal? Yes. Corliss faced the witnesses. Contingency preparation is not a crime. No, Cerys said. But preparation becomes intention when only one class of vessel is chosen to absorb the danger. She returned to the recovered frame. The repair seam preserved more than the puncture. 4 shallow compression marks ran along the outer hull at the same spacing as the broadside braces stored aboard Corliss's flagship. The marks had formed before the hook tore free. The fleet had not merely thrown a line toward the Ashwing during panic. Officers had begun fixing it into the shield assembly. Oren cut the hook before they finished. Cerys traced the untouched air above the seam. Oren saw what they were building. Corliss said, "He interfered before the maneuver could protect the convoy. He interfered before you could lock civilians between the noble gate and your barge. The Ashwing's passengers might have survived behind the reinforced frame." The broadside braces covered 2 passenger exits. The chain fitter looked at the measurements again. She is right. If installed fully, the braces would have sealed the lower doors. The people aboard could not have escaped once the ferry began taking heat. Ilyan's expression changed. Was that permitted under the wartime warrant? Corliss answered carefully. The warrant grants commanders authority to alter civilian vessels under immediate threat. That was not my question. The law does not specify passenger access under every possible configuration. Cerys lifted her banded wrist. Because the law assumed commanders would remove civilians before turning their vessel into armor. The original warrant was brought forward. A clause near the bottom required any requisitioned civilian hull to be cleared of non-combatants before conversion to military use. Corliss did not flinch. The evacuation occurred too quickly to complete every procedural step. The shield assembly was prepared 2 hours early, Cerys said. You had time to choose the ferry. You had time to measure it. You had time to fit the braces. You only lacked time to remove the people whose deaths made the shield useful. Ilyan closed the warrant. His seal had granted the power. Corliss's office had stripped away the condition that restrained it. But Ilyan had renewed that authority for years, without requiring public review of how the fleet used civilian vessels. The law had not forced him to sink the Ashwing afterward. That sentence remained his alone. A harbor runner arrived carrying a sealed repair invoice recovered from the flagship stores. It listed 4 replacement broadside braces ordered the morning after the evacuation. Reason: heat deformation during attempted attachment. The invoice named the receiving hull, Ashwing, and beneath it appeared a second notation. Civilian occupants remained aboard at time of conversion. The invoice changed the shield assembly from preparation into an act performed against occupied civilians. Corliss Bray read the final notation without visible alarm. Repair clerks often summarize damage after the event. The words do not establish that conversion was completed. They establish that your officers attempted it while people remained aboard, Cerys said. Attempted attachment is not the same as deliberate sacrifice. The braces covered the passenger exits. The maneuver was interrupted before full installation. Oren, by unlawful resistance. Cerys looked toward the recovered starboard frame. You keep calling the act unlawful because your office wrote the requisition 17 days after he died. Corliss faced the fleet witnesses. Emergency authority existed before documentation. The noble barge carried the only heat shielding capable of preserving strategic evacuation capacity. The Ashwing was the strongest available civilian hull. It was also full, which is why the conversion was not completed. The chain fitter shook his head. 2 braces were already seated. Corliss turned toward him. You said 4 were prepared. I said 4 were carried. 2 had pressure marks on the Ashwing. Cerys asked the salvage crew to expose the lower frame. Beneath the cooled slag, 2 iron dark impressions crossed the passenger rail. Each matched the width and spacing of the flagship braces. One mark ended at the lower door hinge, the other crushed part of the emergency release. The assembly had not merely approached the ferry. It had begun sealing people inside it. Corliss said. The marks could have formed during collision. No, the metalsmith replied. Both carry clamp pressure. The teeth closed around the frame. Cerys looked at the passenger manifest from evacuation night. 23 people had been recorded aboard the Ashwing when the first civilian signal was cast. 4 disembarked after the noble gate lowered because smoke blocked the forward channel. 19 remained when the towing hook entered. Which of them were removed before conversion? She asked. The fleet records contained no transfer, no rescue notation, no receipt from another vessel. Corliss answered carefully. The absence of transfer records does not prove they remained aboard. The invoice does. It proves what the repair clerk believed. The frame proves the exits were being closed. The maneuver may have been intended to stabilize the ferry until passengers could be moved. Moved where? Corliss gestured toward the noble barge. Behind stronger shielding. The barge had not yet boarded the treaty airs. It had space. The current prevented safe transfer. But not safe enough to stop your officers from chaining the ferry broadside. Cerys asked for the Ashwing's rear support strut. The salvage crew raised another blackened piece from the lava. One end had been cut cleanly. The opposite side had torn under rotational force. Oren's ferry axe had not only severed the towing hook, he had cut the starboard support holding the Ashwing in the flagship's cross-lock geometry. By sacrificing part of the ferry, he allowed the remaining hull to swing with the current instead of resisting it broadside. The maneuver would have damaged the Ashwing. It also reopened the lower passenger door. Oren did not destroy the ferry, Cerys said. He broke the part your officers had turned into a prison. Corliss looked at the cut, and weakened the hull during a surge. He chose a damaged ferry people could escape from over an intact shield they would die inside. The passenger list showed 12 survivors reached the western steps after the Ashwing tore free. 7 were later recovered from ash rafts. The fleet report had credited the noble barge with their rescue. The barge log recorded no such boarding. Cerys found the survivor names in a furnace house shelter book instead. They had arrived burned, soaked in cooling salts, and carrying fragments of black cedar from the Ashwing's lower door. Oren's act had not saved everyone, but the people the fleet claimed he endangered had escaped through the opening he created. Emergency authority had not been used to save lives. It had been used to decide which lives required explanation. Ilyan ordered the shelter record entered into the inquiry. He preserved the wreckage under royal guard and suspended Corliss's authority to requisition civilian vessels until the hearing ended. But the seizure band remained around Cerys's wrist. Her western route remained closed. The Ashwing remained in pieces. Evidence could correct the order of events. It could not restore the handprints burned from the rail. A deep bell sounded from the upper harbor. Every ferry keeper turned toward the red channel. The second bell followed before the first echo faded. Pressure warning. A runner arrived covered in gray ash. South furnace wall has split. 3 worker settlements are moving toward the western steps. How many? Ilyan asked. More than 200. The upper road is blocked. Corliss looked toward the royal fleet. Prepare the eastern noble channel. Lower the gate when the surge reaches the second pillar. Cerys turned on him. That sends the pressure into the civilian cut again. The royal barges can receive the settlement boats behind shielding. The settlement boats cannot reach them once the western cut floods. Corliss said. The Ashwing no longer exists. The remaining civilian ferries lack capacity. Cerys looked at Ilyan. The king had destroyed the only ferry built to survive that channel. Now the people approaching the steps had no vessel large enough to carry them before the next surge. Ilyan ordered every available hull brought forward. The harbor master counted them. 3 narrow ferries, 2 mineral skiffs, 1 damaged ash raft. Not enough. Cerys studied the wreckage laid beneath guard. The Ashwing's main keel was gone, but the starboard frame remained. 2 furnace shell plates had survived. The noble barge still carried the unused broadside braces and lateral chains prepared to turn her ferry into armor. What do you need? Ilyan asked. Not command. Name it. The recovered frame. The unused braces. 3 cooling drums. Every free chain on Corliss's flagship. Corliss stared at her. You cannot build a safe ferry before the surge. No. Cerys pulled against the seizure band until the iron cut into her skin. But I can build one that survives long enough to return. The third pressure bell began to ring. She looked toward the western steps, where the first families were appearing through the ash. Give me the pieces you drowned. The first families reached the obsidian ferry steps while Cerys was still measuring the bones of her dead boat. Children came wrapped in furnace blankets. Old workers leaned on iron tools because they had left their canes behind. Ash coated every face the same gray, erasing rank before the harbor could do it for them. Cerys laid the Ashwing's recovered starboard frame across 2 mineral skiffs. Brace beneath the third rib, she told the chain fitter. Not across it. The frame must bend with the current. Corliss Bray stood above the work platform. This structure has no approved design. Neither did your shield. The fleet cannot permit an accused ferrymaster to carry civilians on an improvised hull. The fleet has no vessel ready to carry them. The noble barges can receive passengers through the eastern channel. The western pressure will close before they reach it. Corliss looked toward Ilyan. Your Majesty, emergency command must remain unified. Ilyan watched Cerys fit the first furnace shell plate over the skiff bows. Your requisition authority is suspended. Not my duty to prevent another civilian loss. You had that duty during the last evacuation. Corliss did not answer the accusation. He returned to procedure. The widow's seizure band bars her from commanding a royal harbor vessel. This is not a royal vessel, Cerys said. She drove a fastening pin through the Ashwing frame. It belongs to no fleet. The iron band tightened around her wrist as though the law objected to the distinction. Ilyan saw the bloodless pressure line appear beneath it. I can suspend its movement restriction. You can suspend the pain. She met his eyes. You cannot suspend what it says about my name. Another pressure bell rang. The red channel brightened beyond the black pillars. Cerys ordered the unused broadside braces cut in half. What had been shaped to seal passengers inside the Ashwing became side rails and heat fins. Corliss's lateral chains became flexible joints between the skiffs. The flagship's cooling drums were emptied beneath the deck, where they could release mineral mist around the hull during a surge. Orin had taught her never to build against heat. Build for what heat makes everything do. He had said. Expand. Twist. Seek the weakest fastening. She did not hear his voice now. She remembered the work. Orin had left no ghost in the wreckage. Only methods earned through 11 winters beside her. The chain fitter tested the frame. It may carry 40. 32, Cerys said. The deck will hold more. The current will not. Corliss looked at the crowd now filling the steps. You will need 6 crossings. 5, if the mineral skiffs hold their seams. The second surge will arrive before the fourth. Then the royal barges should stop waiting behind polished shields and take the eastern families. Ilyan turned to the harbor master. Open both embarkation lines, no rank priority. Corliss said. Treaty passengers are already moving toward the eastern berth. They board with everyone else. That risks diplomatic fracture. Ilyan's expression did not soften. So does another harbor full of dead civilians. It was action, not absolution. The Ashwing still lay broken because he had ordered it drowned. Cerys secured the last chain and stepped onto the temporary ferry. The structure groaned beneath her weight. Ilyan descended toward the boarding platform. She raised one hand. You do not step aboard wearing that. He stopped. Her gaze rested on the crowned dragon clasp at his throat, the volcanic armor, and the black sword carrying the royal flame seal. Corliss said, The king cannot enter a disaster channel without command protection. Then the king stays on shore. Ilyan looked at Cerys. Why? Because no royal emblem commands my deck. A murmur moved through the fleet. Years earlier, he had obeyed the same rule when he boarded the Ashwing in secret. He had removed his clasp and left his guards behind, because Dragonfire panic had made every official vessel unbearable. Now the refusal carried a different weight. You used the crowned seal to take my ferry, Cerys said. You used royal judgment to drown it. If you board this one, you board as weight, hands, and breath. Nothing more. Corliss stepped forward. This is insubordination before the fleet. No, Ilyan said. He unclasped the crowned dragon. The harbor went silent. He removed the black sword next and handed both to the witness clerk. Then he stripped off the outer plates of his armor, until only the dark heat cloth beneath remained. Cerys watched without gratitude. He had obeyed a condition. He had not repaired the harm that made it necessary. "Where do you stand?" he asked. "Rear chain." "I have never worked one." "You have crossed with me enough times to know what happens if you pull too soon." His face tightened at the private truth spoken before witnesses. "I remember." "Then remember without pretending memory is trust." The first 32 passengers boarded. Cerys placed children and the elderly near the cooling drums. Stronger workers took the outer rails. Ilyan stood at the rear chain without crown or command. Corliss remained on the steps. "If the hull fails, the fleet cannot reach you beyond the second pillar." Cerys took the steering bar. "The fleet did not reach us last time." She released the mooring chain. The temporary ferry entered the molten current. Heat struck immediately. The two skiff bows pulled apart, but the cut broadside braces flexed between them instead of locking. Cooling mist rose through the deck seams. The Ashwing frame carried the pressure without resisting it broadside. Behind them, the noble gate began to descend. Cerys looked back. "I ordered it held," Ilyan said. Corliss turned toward the gate tower. "No command was given from my station." A second chain released overhead. Someone inside the harbor mechanism was lowering the barrier before the civilian ferry had cleared. The molten current shifted. Every warning bell on the western steps began to ring. Cerys drove the steering bar toward the narrow cut. The same gate that had killed Oren was sending the surge toward them again. The surge reached the temporary ferry before the noble gate finished falling. Molten pressure struck the port skiff and lifted half the deck toward the black arch above them. Passengers cried out as the flexible chains snapped taut between the two hulls. "Down," Cerys ordered. "Hands beneath the rails. Do not fight the tilt." Ilyan braced at the rear chain. The metal heated red around his grip. "Hold until the third pull," she said. The first pull twisted the Ashwing's recovered frame. The second drove burning debris beneath the starboard heat fin. On the third, Cerys cut the forward guide rope. The ferry swung with the diverted current instead of resisting it. The force that had once broken the Ashwing now carried the temporary hull beneath the descending gate. Stone scraped the upper rail. A furnace blanket caught fire. Ilyan released one hand from the chain and smothered the flames with controlled dragon heat, drawing the fire toward himself rather than letting it spread across the passengers. The effort tightened his breathing. Cerys heard it. Once, she would have moved beside him, lowered her voice, and guided him through the pressure beneath his ribs. Now she kept both hands on the steering bar. "Rear chain," she said. He returned his grip to it. He steadied himself without asking her to carry that burden too. The ferry cleared the gate with less than the height of a child between the rail and the descending iron teeth. Behind them, the barrier struck the current. The western channel erupted. Cerys angled the hull into a narrow shelf of slower lava near the worker settlements. Families waited there beneath collapsing ash awnings, trapped between the broken furnace wall and the canal. She landed hard against the stone. "Children first, then anyone who cannot climb." A settlement foreman stared at the joined skiffs. "That thing will not survive another crossing. It does not need to survive forever." Cerys looked back toward the obsidian steps. "It needs to survive until no one is left here." They unloaded the first passengers and replaced them with 30 more. Ilyan remained at the rear chain. No crown, no armor, no royal order. Only burned hands and the weight she assigned him. On the return crossing, the noble gate had settled too low for the ferry to pass beneath it again. Cerys guided them toward the western maintenance notch. Corliss's officers had built the notch for inspection skiffs, not civilian hulls. It was too narrow for both joined boats. "Release the outer skiff," she ordered. The chain fitters stared at her. "We lose half the deck. We lose the side that already carried the first impact. There are 30 people aboard. And there are more waiting." Cerys removed the locking pin from the damaged port joint. The released skiff drifted against the gate and lodged beneath one iron tooth. The remaining hull dropped violently but stayed afloat. The abandoned skiff became a wedge, holding the barrier several feet above the current. They passed through one-sided. At the steps, harbor workers rushed forward to unload passengers. Corliss stood beside the gate officers. "You have destroyed another vessel under emergency conditions. I used it to keep your gate from crushing civilians. You cannot prove the descent was intentional." Ilyan stepped off the ferry. "I ordered the gate held. The tower may have suffered heat failure." "Then open the mechanism." Corliss's expression did not change. "During an active surge, Opening the tower risks uncontrolled collapse. Cerys secured the surviving hull to the steps. The gate is already falling without command. She pointed to the maintenance stair. Open it now, or I cut the outer counterweight chain and leave the noble berth exposed. The harbor officers looked toward Corliss. Ilyan said, Open the tower. Cerys did not enter with them. More families remained across the canal. She rebuilt the missing side with an ash raft, 2 cooling boards, and the last lateral chain from Corliss's flagship. The result leaned badly and could carry only 24. She made 3 more crossings. On the second, falling slag burned through the forward mist pipe. Ilyan sealed it with a narrow line of dragonfire while Cerys kept the hull aligned. On the third, his breathing shortened again beneath the enclosed gate notch. She did not comfort him. She gave him work. Count the pressure strikes. He obeyed. 4. Tell me when the pause reaches 2 breaths. It did. She turned through the gap before the next surge struck. By the 5th crossing, every child had left the worker shelf. The final passengers were furnace laborers who had stayed behind to carry the injured. Cerys boarded last. The temporary ferry returned to the obsidian steps with 1 cooling drum empty, the ash raft half burned, and the recovered Ashwing frame still holding the hull together. 211 civilians had crossed. No noble gate officer had decided which of them deserved passage. Cerys stepped onto the stone. The seizure band remained around her wrist. Saving the people did not restore her route. It did not raise the Ashwing or return Orin's palms to its rail. Corliss waited beside the open gate tower. The descent mechanism failed under abnormal heat. Cerys entered the tower with the chainfitter and witness clerk. The command lever remained locked in hold position, exactly as Ilyan had ordered. The gate had not descended because someone pulled it. It had descended because the safety pin beneath the counterweight had melted. But the pin was not standard harbor iron. It was a timed melt bolt made from layered slag designed to dissolve when canal heat reached a chosen level. The chain fitter removed the remaining collar. This was installed recently. How recently? Ilyan asked. Fresh furnace oil, no more than a day, Corliss said. Melt bolts are used throughout emergency systems, not on a gate ordered to remain open, Cerys replied. The witness clerk found the maker's stamp beneath the collar. The bolt had come from the Admiralty stores. Corliss answered at once. Any harbor engineer could requisition one. Cerys examined the layered alloy. 3 black bands, 1 silver. The same timing pattern described in the old Red Channel maintenance report. She asked for the gate repair file from the evacuation that killed Orin. The original safety pin had also been replaced on the morning of that disaster. Same layered melt bolt, same chosen heat threshold. The noble gate had not fallen too early by accident on either day. Someone had prepared it to descend only after civilian ferries entered the western current. And this time, they had rebuilt the old mechanism to make Cerys' rescue fail in front of the entire fleet. The new melt bolt proved someone expected Cerys to enter the western current before they expected the noble gate to fail. Corliss Bray stood inside the open tower, while the chain fitter held the black and silver collar beneath a witness lamp. Admiralty stores issue melt bolts for emergency release systems, Corliss said. A maker's stamp proves supply, not sabotage. Cerys examined the layered slag. A normal release bolt melts when pressure threatens the gate itself. This one was built to fail at a chosen canal temperature, which is how timed protection works. Protection for which side? Corliss looked toward the eastern berth, the side carrying the greatest strategic burden. The words were careful. They did not confess to murder. They only admitted that the harbor had measured lives before the lava reached them. Cerys asked for an unused bolt from the same furnace batch. Corliss objected. Testing Admiralty hardware during an active evacuation would waste protected equipment. Then the equipment is more valuable than proving why 2 civilian crossings were nearly destroyed? Ilyan ordered the stores opened. He remained on the tower platform without his sword or crowned clasp. The symbols still waited with the witness clerk below, where Cerys had required him to leave them before boarding her ferry. But their absence did not erase what his seal had done. He had helped save 211 people. He had also drowned the Ashwing. One act could not purchase release from the other. The storekeeper produced 3 melt bolts marked with the same furnace stamp. Cerys had a dry testing cradle built on the obsidian steps, away from the active gate chain. The chain fitter attached weights equal to the noble barrier's counterpressure. Corliss watched the preparation. A furnace test cannot reproduce live current. No, Cerys said. It can reproduce heat. The first standard harbor bolts softened only after the test basin reached gate danger temperature. The second held longer. The Admiralty bolt began to separate at the exact heat recorded during the third pressure bell. Not when the gate itself became unsafe. Not when the eastern berth faced collapse. At the temperature the western channel reached after loaded civilian ferries had already committed to the crossing. The chain fitter removed the ruined metal. This threshold was selected. Corliss answered. Alloy thresholds are always selected. For what purpose? Ilyan asked. To keep the Eastern Fleet from being trapped behind an uncontrolled surge. Cerys turned toward the gate logs from both evacuations. During the disaster that killed Oren, civilian ferries entered the western cut between the first and second pressure bells. The noble vessels remained beyond the eastern pillars. The melt bolt failed at the third. During the present rescue, Cerys entered before the second bell. The replacement bolt began dissolving when the current reached the same threshold. The mechanism did not respond to danger without distinction. It waited until civilians were in the channel. Then it redirected danger toward them. The gate was taught when to betray the western crossing, Cerys said. Corliss's expression remained level. The timing also ensured the noble berth stayed open long enough to preserve command vessels. That is not a different explanation. It is lawful contingency. Lawful because you renewed the warrant that allowed it. Lawful because the King's seal granted fleet officers discretion during catastrophic threat. Ilyan did not turn away from the accusation. My seal granted power to preserve the harbor. Cerys looked at the civilians gathered on the steps. Your admiral decided which people counted as the harbor. The store ledger was brought forward. 2 special melt bolts had been issued from the Admiralty furnace. The first left stores on the morning of the Red Channel evacuation. The second left the previous evening. Both were listed under the same purpose. Contingency stabilization of Noble Gate continuity. No civilian channel effect was recorded. No ferry council had been consulted. No public witness had approved the chosen threshold, Corliss said. Technical calculations do not require civilian consent. They do when civilian bodies provide the pressure test. The issue signatures belong to different engineers. One had died years ago. The other was now missing from the gate tower. Neither signature named Corliss. But each requisition referenced the same sealed alloy formula. Cerys requested it. Corliss resisted for the first time without disguising the force in his voice. That formula is protected command property. Ilyan looked at him. Open it. The formula sheet had been written during the border war. It calculated how long the Eastern Fleet could remain protected if the Noble Gate redirected heat toward the western cut. Most of the figures were military. Current velocity, barge displacement, command survival. Near the bottom, a later amendment changed the civilian loss tolerance. The original wartime limit permitted no gate diversion, while occupied civilian craft remained in the Western Channel. The amendment removed that condition. In its place appeared a new calculation. Western ferry hull may serve as temporary heat break capacity. Corliss said, that language reflects emergency flexibility. Cerys laid the Ashwing's beam measurements beside the formula. The width matched. The furnace shell thickness matched. Even the survival estimate matched the time Oren had kept the damaged ferry afloat after cutting the hook. The formula had not described any civilian ferry. It had described the Ashwing. Who supplied these measurements? Ilyan asked. Corliss answered. Harbor registries contain every licensed hull. Hull. Cerys looked at the date. The amendment had been entered 11 days before the evacuation that killed Oren. Before the channel collapsed. Before emergency authority was renewed. Before Corliss claimed circumstance had forced the fleet to choose. The plan to use the Ashwing as a heat shield had existed before the disaster created an excuse. Corliss placed both hands behind his back. Contingency planners prepare for possible failures. A prepared option is not an issued command. No, Cerys said. But someone prepared the hook, the braces, the crosslock, and the melt bolt that made the option real. The fleet witnesses began carrying the records onto the central harbor platform. Corliss looked toward Ilyan. If you expose protected survival calculations before every ferry crew, no commander will be able to make necessary choices during war. Ilyan's gaze moved from the formula to Cerys' banded wrist. Necessary choices require a record made before blame becomes useful. He ordered Corlys removed from direct gate command pending public examination. Cerys felt no relief. Corlys still held office. The seizure ban still marked her. Her route was still suspended. Oren was still dead. The court had found the design of the weapon. It had not yet judged the king who allowed such authority to exist. The witness clerk unfolded the final page of the formula. At the bottom stood the renewal condition Corlys had submitted to activate Ilyan's wartime warrant. The admiral had not altered the definition of emergency. He had altered the definition of a strategic life. Noble passengers, command officers, and treaty bloodlines were counted individually. Civilian ferry passengers were counted as hull weight. The harbor had measured the people Cerys carried as ballast. Before sunset, Ilyan ordered every evacuation captain, ferry keeper, gate engineer, furnace worker, and surviving passenger onto the obsidian ferry steps. Corlys Bray stood beneath guard beside the opened Admiralty records. He had not confessed. He continued to call the Noble Gate formula lawful planning, the broadside braces emergency preparation, and the attempted conversion of the Ashwing, a necessary use of limited harbor capacity. Cerys placed the evidence in the order the fleet had caused it. First, Ilyan's civilian priority signal. Then the Noble Gate log showing the barrier lowered before the western ferries cleared. The pre-dawn shield assembly measured to the Ashwing's hull. The towing hook from Corlys's flagship. The crosslock set before the first ash bell. The later requisition entry added 17 days after Oren's death. The repair invoice admitting that civilians remained aboard during conversion. The melt bolt designed to fail only after ferry crews entered the western current. Finally, the formula that counted noble passengers as lives and civilian passengers as hull weight. Corlys faced the gathered harbor. Command exists because disaster does not allow equal rescue. Treaty heirs preserved alliances. War officers preserved defense. The Eastern Fleet preserved the kingdom's ability to survive the next attack. Cerys looked toward the workers she had carried across the canal. You did not make an unequal rescue because the lava forced you. She laid one hand beside the Ashwing's recovered frame. You prepared the unequal rescue 11 days before the channel collapsed. The possibility of sacrifice must be calculated before crisis. Then the people selected for sacrifice must have standing before the calculation becomes law. Civilian councils cannot command a royal fleet. No. But royal fleets should not be permitted to convert occupied civilian ferries into armor, and then write the dead as disobedient. A witness clerk read the names of the 14 people who died on the western steps. Oren Dunlow's name came last. Corlys said, Oren cut a lawful towing assembly during evacuation. Cerys turned the starboard frame toward the fleet. The puncture, axe cut, recoil split, and inner resin layer remained visible beneath the final ashfall. Oren cut the mechanism that sealed passengers inside their own ferry. She pointed to the reopened lower door hinge. He damaged the Ashwing so 12 people could escape through this door. He returned to the current because 7 more were still trapped behind the gate. The furnace house shelter record confirmed where the survivors had gone. The noble barge had not rescued them. Oren's broken ferry had. Ilyan descended from the judgment platform. The crowned dragon clasp had been returned to him after the rescue. He removed it again before stepping onto the central evidence platform. The first command was mine, he said. So was the wartime authority Corlys renewed. No one moved. I did not order civilians counted as hull weight. I did not order the Ashwing converted into a shield. Corlys inclined his head slightly, as though the distinction might still save him. Ilyan continued. But I maintained an authority broad enough to permit those acts without civilian witness. When the archive protected that authority, I believed it over the woman whose skill had once carried me safely through these canals. His gaze found Cerys. And when she challenged the record, I sank the remaining evidence with her home. He did not ask her forgiveness. He addressed the harbor. The false record was written by the fleet. Its sentence was made royal by my mouth. The seizure judgment was read again before the same captains who had watched the Ashwing disappear. Then the witness clerk read its correction. Cerys had obeyed the original civilian priority signal. The Noble Gate had redirected lethal pressure into the western channel before civilian clearance. The Ashwing had been unlawfully converted while occupied. Oren Dunlow had cut the towing assembly to release trapped passengers and preserve civilian access to the ferry. The accusation that Cerys abandoned the convoy was struck from every harbor record. Only after the correction entered the public archive did Ilyan unlock the iron band from her wrist. The skin beneath it remained bruised. Law could remove the metal. It could not claim it had never closed around her. Corliss was stripped of gate command, fleet requisition authority, and control of the harbor archive. He was placed under public trial for falsifying records, unlawful civilian conversion, endangering occupied vessels, and engineering noble gate failures. He still did not confess. He called every act necessary for royal continuity. The court would judge what he had done, not wait for him to name it honestly. Ilyan revoked the wartime requisition warrant. In its place, he signed a harbor charter requiring civilian witnesses before any occupied vessel could be converted, diverted, or used as protective capacity. Cerys refused personal ownership of the western route. "One king took it from me," she said. "Another should not be able to return it as a favor." The route was transferred to a civilian ferry council made up of captains, furnace workers, healers, gate engineers, and settlement representatives. Cerys accepted authority as its first elected harbor mistress. The Ashwing could not be restored. Its cabin, stern rail, and Oren's handprints were gone. Cerys placed the surviving starboard frame across the entrance to the new civilian dock. Not as a shrine, but as a working beam every ferry crew passed beneath before entering the canal. Months later, Ilyan came to the obsidian steps before dawn. A newly built ash ferry waited beside the dock. He wore no armor, sword, crown, or dragon clasp. Cerys stood at the steering bar. "You removed the symbols before I asked." "I remembered the rule. Memory is not trust." "No." He held out the revised gate charter. The civilian council rejected 3 clauses. They should reject 5. I brought all 5. He did not ask to command the deck. He did not ask whether she still remembered the nights she had carried him through Dragonfire panic. "May I board?" he asked. Cerys looked at his empty hands. "You may take the rear chain." He stepped aboard as weight, hands, and breath. Nothing more. The ferry entered the molten channel beneath a gate that could no longer decide in secret who was permitted to survive. Cerys did not forgive him that morning. But when the first pressure turn came, she trusted him with the chain. For now, that was the only passage between them she was willing to open.